there are some studies that have been done on seminarians in the aftermath of the McCarrick problems in 2004, 2005. You know the story, broke in Boston first, and then all over the Western world, we heard horror stories of priests doing unspeakable evil things to young people, typically teenage males, but young people in general. And even worse than that was the fact that bishops often knew about it and hid the details themselves, hid the priest away, sometimes trading priests between dioceses like they were members of sports teams. And generally a culture of corruption and hiding things away, going all the way up to Rome. In 2018, when Archbishop Vigano issued his testimony against Francis, he basically said that the Vatican knew about all of this stuff, including Ted McCarrick, like the kingpin of this problem. One of the things they did in the aftermath of this was the USCCB required that seminarians receive psychological evaluation before they could even become a seminarian. Because you want to know if the young men you're teaching to be priests and are going to be entrusting with the future of the church are actually fit to be priests in the first place. A laudable thing, an unfortunate tragedy they had to do it, but laudable as a step. There were some steps they should have taken, though, like kicking all men with James Martin-type inclinations out of the priesthood and stop allowing such men into the seminary. And some dioceses did the latter on that, by the way. For instance, in Portland, Oregon, if you have those inclinations, good luck getting into seminary. You should applaud the bishops, both Sample and his predecessor, who implemented that change. We have some interesting new data here, and I think it's worth going over. This came from UCA News. The headline, New Study Finds Gaps in Assessing Priesthood Candidates. The 171-page report is the fruit of a larger project process of the McGrath Institute, which included a formation summit. Now, there's some things here that I consider kind of red flags because they use very clinical language. And you can use the clinical language they're doing to show that they're screening men out who are too orthodox under the terminology of neuroses, like psychological neuroses. And I say that because there's one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the McCarrick problem was that you would have priests who were very conservative, taught actual Catholicism. Yes, even if they offer the new mass for those of you who think that that's incompatible. There are plenty of examples of priests like that. And what they would end up doing is they would teach from the ambo or tell parishioners unequivocally Catholic things on hot-button issues. And then somebody would get offended and report them to their bishop. And instead of the bishop putting that layperson in their place, would often cancel the priest and offer them a deal with the devil. Either you go into silence and essentially leave the priesthood, or we send you to a psychological health center, like a hospital, where they put the men with McCarrick inclinations to try to rehabilitate them, thus earning that priest the informal accusation of having been like that himself. That was a favorite tactic in the broader Chicago area. There are plenty of these. I believe one of the hospitals called St. Leo's that they do this to men at, thus making it so that priest can never either have ministry again, or if he does, it's like prison ministry. He can never work with families again. So we go to the article, keeping all that in mind. The project was initiated in 2024 by Father Thomas Berg, a visiting professor of the practice at the McGrath Institute, whose research and writings spanned moral theology, bioethics, the McCarrick crises, and seminary formation. The report data represents results from 5 surveys, which polled U.S. diocesan bishops, diocesan vocations directors, seminary rectors, seminary forementors, and spiritual directors, and mental health professionals who work with seminaries. Response rates for each group varied, with just over half, 53%, of the nation's Catholic bishops, 1/3, 33% of diocesan vocation directors, and 59% of seminary rectors participating, along with 111 seminary forementors and spiritual directors and 59 mental health professionals. I'm going to pause here, and I don't talk about my own credentials much, but I have a PhD. I went through a social science program to get a PhD, and I wrote a doctoral dissertation on Catholic social teaching That's not what's important here. In my doctoral studies, I was forced basically to take qualitative and quantitative research methods courses. Quantitative methods are things like surveys, how surveys work, how polls work, and things. And while a lot of people express their skepticism at polls, I don't generally until I look at the numbers on how many people they surveyed, their methods, and then I'll express skepticism. For example, if you ever read a political poll, just because if they actually asked 2,000 people in the US, that's actually scientifically a pretty good poll, but you should dig deeper and find out who they asked. And you start looking at how the partisan inclinations of the people they asked, and then you'll find how skewed things are. It should line up with generally the registration data of the country, give or take. And therein lies kind of my concern with this data, because they got what sounds like at first pretty good turnout, right? 53% of the nation's bishops. Well, that's like a couple hundred people, maybe. A third of diocesan vocations directors, so 100 people, and 59% of seminary rectors, along with 111 seminary form mentors. And so you start getting into a question of what's called the margin of error on this. The plus or minus percentage for dictating whether this is actually good or not. So keep that in mind. But I still think you'll find this data interesting nonetheless, because you're asking a small pool of people and you got a okay amount of people responding. For this kind of survey, 53% is actually what a lot of people who do surveys of small groups would like to get back when it comes to the bishops. But the diocesan vocations directors is a little small, though the seminary rectors are pretty nice. 59% is pretty good. The majority of bishops, 90%, and vocations directors, 84%, who participated in the study said they were satisfied with the formation programs at their seminaries. And 91 to 96% of the two groups indicated they hold in-depth meetings with seminaries at least once a year or more often to discuss candidates. Both groups were also especially likely to have great confidence in how the seminaries cultivate seminarians' openness to growing spirituality, 55 to 59% very confident, and regular engagement in self-reflection. But the report found these three areas where it said both bishops and vocations directors were least likely to express great confidence in their seminaries. Just 19 to 21% were very confident in their formation of seminarians, quote, healthy management of one's neuroses or minor pathologies. What does that mean? Healthy living with medical concerns or physical limitations. So if someone's got some sort of physical handicap of some kind and they're in seminary, or dealing with learning disabilities, 16 to 17%. So this is low confidence among the bishops on those issues. But I'm most curious about healthy management of one's neuroses or minor pathologies, because they have consistently called being conservative a neuroses or a pathology. That is literally the language they tell young men when they start having the talk with them. If they're in seminary and they catch them doing things like praying a preconciliar breviary, praying the rosary too much, being too rigid in the kind of questions they ask in the moral theology classes, or being known to just be too rigid on morality in general, not being synodal enough. And I got that testimony from numerous seminarians who have told me this, from men who had to go get ordained through some unorthodox means because they were drummed out of seminary, because they prayed an old breviary and they prayed the rosary and they believed in fasting and abstinence and things. That's certainly not the problem in every seminary. It's a problem in more than you'd think. You're too conservative. They won't let you in. It's amazing that the seminary classes they're graduating these days are skewing heavily towards conservative priests. Maybe God just overwhelmed their system with their only good candidates to actually become priests being men who are actually Catholic. But it does look like a concern. And I'm taking this just in the rhetoric I've heard them use to describe seminarians. I've heard Pope Francis refer to seminarians being worried about future seminarians as having a pathology of rigidity and clericalist attitudes. And only 1 in 5 of the bishops are very confident in the formation of seminaries' healthy management of it. Rectors, formators, and mental health professionals are also shared the bishops and vocation directors' confidence in seminaries' ability to nurture spiritual openness. What does that mean? And regular self-reflection. What does spiritual openness mean? Now, if that means being open to spiritual direction, you have a good spiritual director and you are open to what they tell you to do to make yourself a better seminarian and thus a better priest, fine. But in the new synodal church, spiritual openness sounds awfully lot like challenging your basic assumptions and being open to other viewpoints in a spirit of dialogue and ecumenical kumbaya. In addition, 32 to 43% of these survey groups said they were confident of seminaries' ability to enable seminarians to form healthy relationships with others and to seek treatment for mental health issues such as depression or anxiety. And that is a red flag. Less than one half of the bishops, or of one half of anybody surveyed, said that their seminarians were had the resources and the ability to seek health on this. And that is key, because if you do not want any more priests making headlines for all the wrong reasons, you need to nail this. At least this is part of it. Now, the problem is, if you want to nail depression and anxiety, part of it is helping them to grow deeper in their faith, in the actual Catholic faith. But the three groups who are most likely to have regular day-to-day interactions with seminarians were least likely to be confident of how seminaries help those in formation to, quote, manage neuroses or minor pathologies, 1 in 5 at best. Growing an understanding with the survey termed their, quote, their inclinations of the flesh. Why is that a question? Growing an understanding with the survey termed about, who they're attracted to. Why is that even a question? You're supposed to screen the men out to make sure they're not men like James Martin, to prevent that problem from growing and getting worse. Because it's the men like James Martin who become like men like Ted McCarrick. Not in every case, certainly. I'll be the first to admit it. Not in every case, but in enough cases that it became a systematic problem. And only 8 to 22% of the bishops or the people being surveyed were confident in their entire system's ability to help people grow an understanding of what they mean by their attractions. They shouldn't have to understand that, because all you have to do is make sure your men have natural inclinations and then understand their vocation, and that they are essentially offering those inclinations, that natural desire to be, shall we say, to be fathers, on the altar to God with their vocation. And then only 4 to 22% were confident in the seminary's ability to soundly manage the seminarian's unhealthy or addictive behaviors. What unhealthy behavior? They mean like maybe they like to hit the bottle a little much. Maybe they they play video games a little much, something like that. Is that what they mean? I'm hoping that's what they mean here. But even then, if it's only 4 to 22%, then you've got a gigantic problem in the system, because these things are all linked. Manage past unethical behaviors, including dishonesty and financial mismanagement. Now, what they mean by dishonesty, we don't know, but like financial mismanagement, you let somebody like that in the seminary? That's interesting. Why would you let somebody with a, maybe, they were, 12, they got caught shoplifting. Okay, whatever. That's a lot of people who become very productive members of society and good people make that mistake when they're a kid. But like something worse, letting them into the seminary? I don't know. I'm curious what you think of all this. An interesting comment here. My read says, I know a priest recently retired who said he had to run away, close his eyes all through seminary if he wanted to get out and be ordained. Yes, you're referring to what some people call pink palaces, I think. The name implies what they are. A lot of seminaries are basically taken over by James Martin types, and nobody was living their vows, we'll say, in those places. There had been an effort by Benedict to clean those up. I've been periodically in touch with a priest who watches the show, who tells me that he has a lot of experience trying to handle that issue in his diocese, and paid the price for it because he was actually Catholic, and the others were big on synodal encounters. Now, I'm curious what you have to say about this, so let me know in the comments. Please pray for the seminarians. They desperately will need them. And please pray that these scandals that we've been covering the last few days, involving men unfit to receive honors by bishops, that they repent, and the bishops who are trying to do this also repent. Your prayers are appreciated. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.